Most people think attraction is simple, but it isn't. It's not just physical, it's not just emotional, it's psychological, and far deeper than most people are willing to confront. Because every now and then you come across someone who doesn't just connect on the surface, but sees you, sees your patterns, your emotions, even the parts of yourself you try to hide. And that kind of depth is not easy to handle. In fact, for many people, it's overwhelming. Because when an empath connects with you, it's not casual, it's intense, it's layered, and it's revealing. And that level of connection can feel powerful, but also dangerous. Most people move through relationships at a surface level, even when they believe they're going deeper. They focus on what's being said, what's being shown, what's easy to understand, but there's an entire layer beneath that, subtle, complex, and often uncomfortable, that goes largely unnoticed. And this is where empaths operate. They don't just listen to your words, they pay attention to the space between them, the hesitation before you respond, the shift in your tone when something touches a nerve, the way your body language contradicts what you're trying to present. These are not things most people consciously register, but for an empath, they're impossible to ignore. It's not something they switch on or off. It's how they experience the world. So when they connect with someone, it's not limited to what's visible. They begin to piece together a much deeper picture. Not just who you are on the surface, but who you are underneath the roles, the defenses, the habits you've built over time. And that kind of perception changes the nature of the interaction entirely. Because now you're not just being engaged with, you're being understood in a way that bypasses the usual filters. The parts of yourself that you keep hidden, sometimes even from yourself, don't remain hidden for long. They show up in small ways, subtle ways, but clear enough for someone who knows how to look. And that can feel incredibly powerful. To be seen like that, to be understood without having to explain everything, it creates a sense of closeness that most people rarely experience. It feels real, authentic, almost magnetic. Because for once, you're not just being accepted for what you present, you're being recognized for what you actually are. But there's another side to that. And because being understood at that level also means being exposed. Not in a harmful or intentional way, but in a way that removes the comfort of illusion. The stories you tell yourself, the identities you rely on, the emotional patterns you've never fully examined, they don't hold up the same way under that kind of awareness. And for many people, that's where discomfort begins. Because it's one thing to be liked, it's another thing entirely to be known. When someone can sense your emotional state before you even articulate it, when they can pick up on contradictions between what you say and what you feel, it creates a kind of pressure. Not from them, but from the situation itself. You're faced with a level of clarity that you may not be used to, and if you're not prepared for that, it can feel overwhelming. You may not even understand why. You might just feel drawn in, while at the same time wanting to pull away. Because part of you is attracted to the depth, to the authenticity of the connection, but another part of you resists it, because it challenges the way you've learned to navigate relationships. And that tension is important, because it reveals something most people avoid, the difference between shallow connection and real understanding. Empaths don't settle for surface level interaction, not because they're trying to complicate things, but because they naturally move toward what is real, toward what is emotionally and psychologically true, even if it's not immediately comfortable. And when you encounter that level of depth, you're left with a choice to stay where things are easy and predictable, or to step into something far more revealing. Because when someone sees you that clearly, you can no longer hide behind who you pretend to be. And when that kind of depth enters the picture, something else follows closely behind intensity. Not the kind of intensity people casually refer to, but something far more profound, something that disrupts the usual rhythm most people are comfortable with. Because the truth is, most relationships are built on a kind of unspoken agreement to stay within certain limits. You reveal a little, you hold a little back. You express just enough to connect, but not enough to feel exposed. It keeps things manageable, predictable, safe. But when an empath is involved, those limits begin to dissolve. The connection doesn't stay on the surface for long. It moves inward quickly and almost effortlessly. Conversations become more meaningful. Silences carry weight. Even simple interactions start to feel layered, as if there's always something deeper unfolding beneath what's being said. And for someone who isn't used to that, it can be overwhelming. Not because it's negative, but because it's unfamiliar. You see, most people have learned to function within a certain emotional range. They've adapted to interactions that are controlled, measured, and often filtered. It allows them to maintain a sense of stability. They know what to expect, and more importantly, they know how to respond. But intensity disrupts that. It introduces a level of unpredictability, not in behavior, but in experience. You start feeling things more strongly. You become more aware of your own emotional responses. The connection demands presence, attention, and honesty in a way that can't be easily avoided. And that's where resistance begins. Because while part of you may be drawn to that intensity, curious about it, even fascinated by it, another part of you feels the pressure it creates. The pressure to be real, the pressure to respond authentically, the pressure to confront emotions you may have kept at a distance for a long time, and most people are not prepared for that. They haven't practiced sitting with that level of emotional clarity. They haven't developed the awareness required to navigate it without feeling destabilized. So instead of leaning into it, they begin to pull back, sometimes subtly, sometimes abruptly. They may label it as too much without fully understanding what that means. They may feel the connection is moving too fast or becoming too intense, even if nothing externally dramatic has happened. What they're really reacting to is the depth itself, the fact that the interaction is no longer operating within familiar boundaries. And this creates a kind of internal conflict. Because on one hand, there's a desire for something real, something meaningful. But on the other hand, there's a fear of what that reality might reveal. And when those two forces collide, most people default to what feels safer. They retreat, not necessarily from the person, but from the intensity of the experience. And that's why this dynamic can feel confusing. You may notice someone becoming distant right when things start to feel more genuine. You may sense a shift that doesn't match the connection that was building, but it's not random. It's a response to something they weren't ready to handle, because depth requires presence. And presence requires a level of self-awareness that most people have not fully developed. It asks you to sit with discomfort, to remain engaged even when things feel uncertain, to resist the urge to escape into distraction or avoidance. And that's not easy. So when someone encounters that level of intensity without the tools to process it, the natural reaction is to step away, to regain a sense of control, to return to a space where things feel more manageable. And that's the reality most people don't talk about. It's not that depth is undesirable, it's that it demands more than most people are ready to give. Because when a connection becomes truly intense, it stops being easy to ignore who you really are. And when that intensity reaches a certain point, something even more revealing begins to take shape. Something that most people don't expect and often try to avoid. Because an empath doesn't just feel deeply, they reflect, not in an obvious way. Not by pointing things out directly or confronting you with harsh truths, but through their presence, through the way they respond, through the way they see you, they begin to act as a mirror. And that mirror doesn't just show you what you want to see. It shows you what is. The parts of yourself you're proud of, the qualities you present confidently to the world, those are easy to recognize, but alongside them something else starts to surface. Subtle inconsistencies, unresolved emotions. Patterns of behavior that you may have never fully examined, and suddenly you're not just interacting with another person, you're encountering yourself. That's where things become complicated. Because most people are comfortable with a version of themselves that they've carefully constructed, a version that feels stable, familiar, and able. But that version often leaves things out. It avoids certain truths, it smooths over certain flaws, it protects you from having to look too closely at what might be uncomfortable. But a real mirror doesn't do that. It doesn't distort, it doesn't soften, it simply reflects. So when you reflect, when you're in the presence of someone who naturally picks up on emotional undercurrents, who notices contradictions between what you say and what you feel, who responds not just to your words but to your state, that reflection becomes difficult to ignore. You might notice it in small moments, a pause that feels longer than usual, a look that seems to understand more than you've explained, a response that touches on something you didn't even realize you were expressing. And in those moments, something inside you shifts because you realize, consciously or not, that you're being seen beyond the surface. And that can be deeply unsettling, not because there's anything wrong with being understood, but because understanding removes the distance you've created between who you are and how you present yourself. It closes the gap It brings everything into alignment, and if that alignment reveals something you haven't dealt with, it creates tension. You may feel exposed even if nothing has been said. You may feel a need to pull back, to regain control of how you're perceived, to reestablish the boundaries that kept things predictable. Because facing yourself is not a comfortable process. It requires honesty. It requires responsibility. It requires a willingness to acknowledge parts of your personality that don't fit the image you prefer to maintain. And most people spend a great deal of time avoiding that. So when someone comes along who, without effort, begins to reflect those hidden aspects back to you, it creates a kind of internal pressure, a pressure to either grow or retreat. And this is where the dynamic becomes clear. It's not that the empath is doing something intentionally. They're not trying to expose or challenge you. They're simply operating at a level of awareness that naturally brings things to the surface. But the effect is the same, because once you've seen something about yourself, even briefly, it's difficult to completely ignore it again. And that's why this kind of connection can feel both compelling and uncomfortable at the same time. You're drawn to the clarity, to the authenticity, to the sense that something real is happening. But at the same time, you're confronted with aspects of yourself that require attention, reflection, and possibly change. And not everyone is ready for that. Because the mirror doesn't just show you who you are when things are easy, it shows you who you are when you can no longer hide. And as all of this begins to unfold, the depth, the intensity, the reflection, there's a point where people start to confuse what they're experiencing. They feel the connection, they feel the pull, and they immediately label it as attachment. But that's not entirely accurate, because what they're responding to is not dependency, it's awareness. You see, most people are familiar with a certain kind of connection, one that is built on reassurance, repetition, and emotional predictability. It feels secure because it follows patterns they understand. There's a rhythm to it, a kind of mutual dependence that keeps both people engaged, even if it's not entirely healthy. And over time, that gets mistaken for something deeper. But when an empath is truly aware, when they are not operating from a place of unconscious need, their connection works very differently. They can engage deeply, feel intensely, and still remain grounded in themselves. They don't lose their identity in the process. They don't rely on the other person to define their emotional state, and that creates a kind of paradox, because on one hand, the connection feels incredibly strong. There's presence, attention, emotional clarity, all the things people associate with closeness. But on the other hand, there's no desperation behind it, no clinging, no silent negotiation to keep the other person from leaving. And for many people, that's unfamiliar. They're used to equating depth with attachment. They believe that if something feels intense, it must also be permanent. That if someone understands them deeply, that person will stay no matter what, that the connection itself guarantees continuity. But that's not how it works here, because awareness changes the rules, and empath who understands themselves is not driven solely by emotion. They're guided by clarity. They can recognize when something is real, and they can also recognize when something is unhealthy. And when that line is crossed, they don't stay out of habit or fear. They step back, and that's where things shift dramatically. Because the other person, who may have interpreted the depth of the connection as a form of attachment, suddenly realizes that it doesn't operate the way they expected. The intensity is still there, but it's no longer tied to dependence. It's not something that can be controlled or assumed. It's conditional, not in a manipulative way, but in a grounded, self-aware way. It exists as long as it remains real, balanced, and aligned. And once that alignment breaks, the empath doesn't chase it. They don't argue endlessly trying to restore what's been lost. They don't compromise their sense of self to maintain the connection. They don't hold on simply because it once felt meaningful. They let it go, not easily, not without feeling, but with clarity. And that's what makes this so difficult for others to process, because they were raw, responding to the intensity, assuming it meant permanence. They felt the depth and believed it created a kind of emotional security. But when that same person steps away calmly, without chaos, it challenges that assumption completely. It forces a realization that the connection was never about control or possession or emotional dependency. It was about presence, and presence cannot be forced to stay. So what you're left with is a new understanding of what that intensity really was. Not something to hold on to at all costs, but something that existed because it was genuine and ended because it was no longer aligned. And that realization is not always easy to accept, because it means letting go of the idea that depth guarantees attachment and understanding that true connection only remains where there is clarity. And when you've moved through all of that, the depth, the intensity, the reflection, the realization that connection is not the same as attachment, you begin to understand what people mean when they describe this as dangerous. But it's important to clarify something here because the word itself is often misunderstood. The danger is not in the person, it's in the impact. Because when you experience a connection that operates at that level, where you are seen clearly, where your emotions are felt and reflected, where the interaction is no longer superficial, it begins to dismantle certain illusions you may have been relying on. Illusions about yourself, about your relationships, about what you thought connection was supposed to be. And once those illusions begin to break, you can't simply go back to the way things were. You start to notice things you didn't notice before, patterns in your behavior, the way you respond to certain situations, the roles you've been playing without questioning them, the ways in which you've avoided looking too closely at your own emotional landscape. And that awareness can be unsettling because it places responsibility back in your hands. It's no longer about what the other person is doing or not doing. It's about what you're seeing, what you're recognizing, and what you choose to do with that understanding. And for many people, that's where the discomfort intensifies. Because awareness demands change, not forced, immediate change, but the kind that comes from no longer being able to ignore what you now know. It asks you to confront habits that no longer serve you, to question beliefs that once felt stable, to step out of patterns that once felt familiar, even if they were limiting. And that's not easy. In fact, it can feel like a loss at first. The loss of certainty, the loss of simplicity, the loss of the ability to move through relationships without thinking too deeply about them. What once felt straightforward now feels layered. What once felt manageable now requires reflection. But within that discomfort, there is also something else, clarity. That a kind of clarity that doesn't come from external advice or temporary reassurance, but from direct experience, from having seen yourself more honestly than before, from having felt a level of connection that revealed both your strengths and your vulnerabilities. And that clarity changes the way you move forward. You become more intentional, more aware of where you invest your energy, more selective about the kind of connections you allow into your life, not out of fear, but out of understanding. Because once you've experienced that level of depth, surface level interaction, no longer satisfies you in the same way. You start to recognize when something is real and when it's not, when something is aligned and when it isn't. And with that recognition comes a quiet form of control, not over others, but over yourself. Your decision that become clearer, your boundaries become stronger, your sense of self becomes more stable, less dependent on external validation or temporary emotional highs, and that's where the real transformation takes place. Not in the connection itself, but in what it reveals and what it changes within you. Because the true impact of that experience is not that it binds you to someone else, but that it forces you to finally face yourself